Good afternoon, Trudy and Harris, and welcome. So we're going to get going immediately on this next panel, and I'll hand over to Saul to take it forward.
Great,
thank you so much.
Okay, thanks everyone. Welcome to the after lunch session. We'll try to keep it exciting so that you don't fall asleep. So our topic is, what is the role of industrial policy in enabling cities to become drivers of economic growth? We have on the panel Glenn Robbins in the room, and we've got Trudy Makaya online, and Harris Selod, who's from the World Bank. I'll give you all a chance to introduce yourself in the next few minutes. I'll just do a quick overview of some of my key thoughts on the topic, and then I'm going to ask each of the presenters just to introduce themselves and then give their insights onto this topic of what is the role of industrial policy in enabling cities to become drivers of economic growth. I think it... They can't hear me, but I'm talking so loudly. I'll have a sip of coffee. Trudy, can you hear us? You can hear.
Now I can hear.
Excellent, thank you. Good to see you. Okay, sorry, Trudy, I was saying, and Harris, I was saying that I've just introduced you, and what I'll do is just give an overview of the topic, as I said in my note, and then give you a chance to introduce yourself a bit more, and then also give your insights into this topic. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I wanted to raise around this topic. So it's thinking around how we look at integrating industrial policy and local economic development. And I would argue that there's a series of tensions. And I think the presentations this morning, I think Glenn highlighted it very closely, where he said a lot of the national policy isn't reflected in capturing local economic development. So some of what we've been thinking about is, what is the role of industrial policy to support sustainable strategies to reduce some of the irrational spatial inequalities that were entrenched under apartheid? And part of that is, the viability of trying to industrialize everywhere equally. And that's also come through in the last 2 days. I think that's been an important point that we see some of the data on it and the challenges around that. Just thinking about it, for industrial policy, then that requires spatial challenges on different potential in different regions. So we've got the historic labor sending areas that have different resources and prospects, and how do they then, how are they then able to link into national and international value chains, or are they able to? And what does that mean to integrate economic development into those areas that, I think we've had the discussion, they are the weakest and they have less to offer. But if we leave them behind, we get the political pushback around that, and then that creates the kind of policy framework that we see. So there needs to be some thinking about how do we think about integrating them in to what we're looking at. Then, unless we see a different economic pathway for rural areas, we are going to see this rural-urban migration. And it remains high, and it will continue to grow. And as we know, and I think Ivan mentioned this, we haven't seen the cities being able to accommodate this influx in any sort of coherent way. And then what does that mean for regions that have limited economic potential? So we can see rural areas in terms of population numbers, they haven't grown at all. So from 96 up until now, there's been almost no population growth. So people have been, voting with their feet, they've been leaving. Whereas some of the big cities, for example, in Gauteng, we've seen a doubling in numbers. So Joburg doubling in number, Cape Town, I'm sure, would be pretty close to that. I think we do have data somewhere on there. But then, in terms of our constitutional system, the local government, has certain requirements to support economic development, but it's limited. And so in the paper, I'm referring to a paper that we wrote, and it's on our website. What we argue there is that there's a lot of burden given to local government to drive economic development, but they're not properly given the constitutional mandate, so they're actually required to work with the other spheres of government in order to drive economic development. But they try this go-it-alone strategy for whatever reasons, and maybe because of failings at national, and I think that is part of the discussion today. But they don't have the finances, the resources, or the human resources, the capacity, or we would argue a real mandate to take the lead on industrial policy. So national government needs to do that in partnership with local government. But because of the separations, there needs to be a negotiation on who does what and how municipalities come on board in terms of what they provide. And then part of it is local leaders, are under pressure to promote economic development, but they don't have a lot of the resourcing. So what can they provide in terms of infrastructure, using regulation strategically, and working with the other spheres? So part of what we need to think about, and I hope we'll get to in some of the discussion today, is what is the clear role for local authorities and cities in that frame, or do they just say, we'll go it alone and just try and do it all? I've spoken a bit about the resources. That's the third point, and there's a bit of a chicken and egg, and I think it was, it's if you don't get the growth, then you're not going to get the tax base. But what that means is that there's disparities. So those that are growing faster will have more resources to put into all the nice things that would attract new investment. So that becomes a challenge. And then in terms of what national government does, and it is part of what we've been discussing over the last 2 days, is national government comes in and says, okay, we'll do the support for the areas that have less resources. It was covered in some of the other presentations, and on the sidelines we've been having some of these discussions. Which means that those that have less resources, the drive then is how do they support economic development and focus on their core functions, probably more important for them because they need to get that alignment with national, but have less capacity to implement. But then how do we think about increasing spending in less industrial areas? So part of the logic of economic development is that where you have productivity and growth, if you put more investment, you're going to get higher returns, but yet we're not seeing that in the national policy. And Glenn's presentation this morning was really a useful precursor to this discussion, because it really does highlight some of that disconnect, that we're not seeing national investing in quite the same way in terms of driving that economic growth. And it's articulated in the policy approach. And then my last point is, before I'll hand over to the panel, is that since democracy, we haven't really seen the right platforms for engaging. So we've got ad hoc engagement platforms. At some point there were min-max. At some point the min-max even brought, for those who does everyone know what min-max are? But it was the ministerial MEC kind of thing. But then they'd bring in the key municipalities at some point. But it wasn't a clear platform that continue to operate. So they were quite active in, I think, the Mbeki era, and then they started to meet less regularly. So that was a political engagement that sort of kind of stopped. And then the in-depth engagement where local governments or metros engage with provincial and national together in the same room about economic development strategies just aren't there consistently. And that is, one of the key issues that around the alignment. So on particular projects, there's certainly, so if you've got an SEZ, there's going to be lots of engagement. But in terms of overall strategy and collaboration, it's not as consistent as it should be if we want to put cities and municipalities at the center of some of what we need to do around industrial development and industrializing. So that's my few points to open it up. I have brought in, and Glenn did make the point in an email, that I am bringing in municipalities, not just cities. But it is part of the discussion where if you're sitting in a marginal municipality and there's a contestation around where the resources go that does impact on cities. So I think it's a useful discussion to include them for this particular panel session. So let me start online. I'm going to start, Trudy, if you don't mind starting, and then I'll move to Harris and then Glenn. So just 3 or 4 minutes, just introduce yourself, give your opening thoughts, and then we can move to, I've got lots of questions, but I don't know if we'll get through all of that, but we can move to some discussion after that. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. My name is Trudy Makaya. I am formerly economic advisor to President Ramaphosa. I've also been the Deputy Competition Commissioner and worked on competition policy for some time. So that's me in a nutshell. Just a quick word on why I actually couldn't be there is that this week we launched a report supporting the National Business Initiative called Powering Futures, the Green Skilling Opportunity. And it's basically looking at kind of the human capital that we will need for the just energy transition. And so I've had to present it here too. But one of the reasons I also wanted to mention it is that we did quite a detailed municipality by municipality quantification, the best that we can, on available information of what the skills needs are going to be, given a IRP, but also a project pipeline, ESCOM transmission development plan, et cetera, et cetera. So bringing all of those data sources to say, at municipal level, these are the skills that you're going to need, and so trying to galvanize and inform a skilling strategy for the just transition. But what that exercise did was also to show the extent to which the transition requires very dispersed value chains in renewable energy in areas, some of which had never had industrial development before, but also in green hydrogen, new energy vehicles, battery manufacturing. And you find projects being mooted in places that to date have not really been part of the core economic areas in the country. Projects in Northern Cape, of course, but also Free State and Mpumalanga. So it is interesting that in terms of diversification, there is prospects of diversification coming from that. Now, focusing a bit more on the topic at hand in terms of cities, and I see, Saul, you've also broadened it to municipalities. I mean, this issue is quite close to my heart. I grew up in Hammanskraal, next to the Babelegi Industrial Park, which was a homeland era industrial park, which kind of followed the same logic of trying to have industrial development propped up in an area where it necessarily would not have arisen. I think Hammanskraal is different because it's reasonably close to Gauteng, but still, it wasn't an obvious location for industrial activity. And of course, we saw that once subsidy support was not as forthcoming as it was under the previous policy, that industrial park has suffered, and really also raises these questions about how you deal with spatial dynamics and spatial location. So a few points I want to make on this. I think first of all, overall, in terms of industrial policy, there is a conversation that has to be had about the performance orientation of our industrial policy, because we do have lots of instruments that have been deployed at national level, some of which find expression at local level. But in terms of the actual outcomes that we've seen from this, we have a few good case studies and examples that have yielded results. The automotive sector is much cited. But beyond that, I think we have industrial policy that doesn't necessarily translate into exports, employment, even necessarily significantly altering where investment goes. And so if we think about how cities are going to engage with this, they need to think quite carefully about what the local metrics are going to be to say this is a successful approach towards industrial policy. Then secondly, the next point I wanted to raise was in terms of spatial thinking in general. I mean, there was a time when there was a lot of work in economic development around, how do you foster local economic clusters? How do you get agglomeration economies going? How do you also work to have coalitions at local level between business, labor, social partners, civil society, to think about how to develop local level clusters that are self-sustaining and that are able to create jobs. Now, that classic cluster approach seems to have faded in recent times, and understandably there was a pushback or a drawback on industrial policy. But it seems like this is the right opportunity to return to that and think about how, whatever the local context might be, but I mean, here we're looking at cities, so this is not even much of a constraint. Most cities can think and capitalize on their endowments to really develop effective clusters that are able to attract investment, but also do so in a way that speaks to the local economic conditions. Now, having said this, I mean, I also had the experience of working on the President's investment mobilization drive. And a lot of the investments would really struggle when they hit the local level, city level, municipal level, where there would be constraints starting all the way from planning, authorizations, connections to electricity, all of those things you think about in terms of local ease of doing business. But it went even beyond that. For some of the investments that were really in far-flung areas, there would be concerns about water supply, but I suppose that's also becoming a national issue. There would be concerns about local law enforcement. So it does seem that if we're going to have an effective cluster approach, you need to get local stakeholders to be engaging on those kinds of issues, but not at national level, because that's not where the constraints are, but empowering local authorities to really develop strategies that make sense and to give them the tools to do that. Then as I draw, I think my 4 minutes are over, there was the point that was made about structures, where all different spheres of government interact. I think from my experience, it's not all that pessimistic. I think the only issue is that, I think to Saul's point, the structures are not sticking. So there was the Presidential Coordinating Council, which has ministers, premiers, mayors of key metros. And there was an effort in the sixth administration to make sure that that structure meets, to discuss local economic development, like provincial plans and also city level plans in that forum. So, it exists, it's there, and perhaps what it needed was real revitalization in terms of the quality of ideas that are put forward in front of it. Similarly, the district development model was fine in terms of what the work that was done in the pilot areas where, government would descend at all levels to really bring everyone together to develop one plan that has a thread from national, provincial to local level. But beyond those 3-4 areas that were chosen, it hasn't gained traction. But it is an attractive model because it really did try to say, how do we make sure that national instruments find resonance at local level and that there's a laser focus on local economic development. So those are two structures which exist, which maybe are going through the motions at the moment, but which hold great potential in terms of actually trying to drive local industrial policy. So let me pause there. Thank you, Saul.
Thanks, Trudy. Harris?
Yes, hello, Saul. Hello, Trudy. Nice to meet you. Hi, Glenn. Hello, everyone. My name is Harris Solod. I am a research economist with the research department of the World Bank. I'm mostly working on urban development issues. I'm not an industrial policy expert, but I think I can talk a little bit at the intersection of the two fields. So let me first start by saying thank you for, inviting me. Also, I'm not talking, as an official representative of the World Bank, just giving you my, expert position on some of the ideas that you've raised. There are so many things to be said. It's difficult to start, with one. But maybe starting with what you first said, Saul, was the stark spatial imbalances that you have in South Africa. We know it's a legacy from the past, but also 30 years after this, past has been removed, we are still almost at the same point. So I think it's really important to understand what's happened, and it talks to two issues. The first is maybe the limited success of any of the policies that South Africa has tried to implement in order to attract jobs to poor locations, whether it is the macro policies or the place-based policies in those locations. And the second point, I think it's important to understand, is that there are some economic mechanisms that sustain the disparities. So we've talked about rural, urban areas. We can talk also about within city disparities. For instance, the townships are very far away from jobs. There's something that we call the spatial mismatch, the disconnection between the places of residence and the places where jobs are located. This creates unemployment and poverty, does not attract jobs. It's kind of a vicious circle, a spatial poverty trap, if you want. So how do we get out of this? And I think, truly, you said we need to understand the spatial dynamics of inequality. I think it's very important to have some kind of diagnostic. Before we talk about how to implement the industrial policies, we need to understand why we have those issues, what is the problem, what are the market failures at hand, what type of policies can be implemented, whether it's industrial policy or other types of policies. For instance, in the case of the spatial mismatch that I was discussing, there are three options. Basically, you can bring, people to jobs, which has not occurred. You can better connect people and jobs. So there's a lot about the transportation policies, but you can also try to attract the jobs. And that would be the industrial policy in that case. So how to industrialize? When we look at industrial policy, that is, an effort to attract or to develop a particular sector in a particular location, we need to understand, as I said, the justification for the policy. Do we need it? But then what is the objective? Are we trying to jumpstart agglomeration? Some type of local push? Are we more looking at promoting exports? In the case when the domestic market is too small, to absorb production, which also can be the case in South Africa. What instruments are we looking at? Subsidies, investments, regulations, they're all very different with different implications, different stakeholders. Who are the targeted beneficiaries? Does it to be the local business that are in situ or new businesses? Do we need to target people like workers? Do we have proper assessments of those policies before we talk about how to implement them? And I think it's very important to have economic assessments of the social value of the policy, which we're probably failing to have in most cases. There are thousands of place-based policies around the world, and economic assessment is very, very seldom done in a robust way. But assuming there's proper design and there's proper assessment, the question is who implements? Is there room for political capture that will derail the policy off track? What is the capacity for implementation? What are the complementary policies that you need to have in addition to the industrial policy in order to create the enabling environment? Do you need to provide education, healthcare? The issue of security is very important. I assume that many of the businesses in South Africa are reluctant to locate in poor areas because of security issues. So that's first remark. Now, you asked an important question: should every district industrialize equally? In my opinion, I think there are two arguments to actually say no. The first argument is an efficiency argument. If we look at economic theory, economic geography, as Trudy mentioned, the idea is that density, increases productivity. So you have to create those agglomeration in, some places, main cities. Those are the motors, the engines of development. But this creates a core periphery structure. But it can be preferable in the aggregate. The question is, can there be redistribution from the rich areas to the poor areas? That's very important. If you don't want to do redistribution, then it's some type of failure on the equity dimension. Also, as Trudy mentioned, you need to have a potential for growth, right? Is a targeted location having a comparative advantage, natural endowment, like a first nature endowment or second nature endowment? Is it well connected to the domestic market, to international markets? This is very important. So we do not need to target all the districts because they are not equally endowed in terms of those advantages. The other argument is also actually the equity argument. I think, as I said, you need some redistribution. Maybe it's a better use of the resources in places that have very little productive capacity to have safety nets. And then you invest in places that have potential for growth and safety nets in places that do not have potential for growth. You cannot disentangle the two. They have to, they go hand in hand. There was the question of the limited capacity of the government, or the limited authority of the government, given the constitution mandate. I don't know the South African constitution. I'm not familiar with it. But I think it's fair to say that different government levels should have different roles and different capacities. So it makes sense for the national level to have a broad vision. They have some fiscal capacity. They can optimize across locations, right? They can say, okay, it makes sense to have more industries here, but not there, based on a robust economic analysis. But then the local government has, of course, a role to play. They have better knowledge of the local context in order to make informed decisions. They may have some fiscal capacity as well. What is important is the coordination between the two, right? For the design of the policy, and I think it's important to have the platform, but also for implementation. You're not on your own. You cannot go alone. I think all levels of government have to be involved. And I understand the tension, but maybe the question is what level of decentralization or devolution is optimal? I don't have the answer. I'm just talking in a very generic term, but I'd like to raise the issue.
Okay, Harris.
And one thing also I noticed.
Okay, do you want to stop there, and then we'll come back to some of the other discussion. Okay. Let's give Glenn a chance to give his opening remarks, and then we'll come back to discussion on some of the other questions that we've got there. Thanks very much for your opening input, Glenn.
I'm not going to say too much to start with because you had the mispleasure of having to listen to me earlier, but I'll just talk a bit about my experience with doing industrial policy at the local level. So when I first joined local government in Durban in 1995, it was just as South Africa was going through a period of accelerated reduction in its tariffs. Pushing towards an export orientation policy, and between the sort of first round of those reductions as part of the GATT round in the early 90s through to about 96, 97, Durban lost between 38 and 45,000 jobs in clothing and textiles. So being employed as one of the first economists to work in a municipality in the country at that time, that was really the problem that we were faced with. What does the municipality do? So of course we went knocking at national government, and we said there's this massive loss of firms and jobs. What do we do about this? And they said, well, you know, across the country, these problems will be experienced in very different ways, but we think that the ultimate gains will bring benefits to Durban in terms of increased foreign direct investment because of the export orientation. So just stick around and you'll see some benefits flowing to you. I left the municipality in Durban in 2003, and that was the first year we saw significant employment growth of the 9 years. So the person I handed over to be the next head of economic development claimed that my leaving actually caused the first opportunity for the city's economy to grow, which might have been true perhaps. But the question is, so what did we do faced with that challenge? In a context where a city had to respond to these massive inherited inequalities, a strong push from the RDP to deal with basic needs provision, you know, we looked around, and this was before there was a new constitution, so which came through in '96. Before there was a lot of local government legislation saying this is what you can and can't do. And we spent quite a lot of time trying to learn from what people were doing in Asia and in Europe and North America. And one of the things that we found together with industries in Durban, that in order to respond to this crisis, and remember in '97 there was the Asian financial crisis which further hit the city, and then followed by that China's access into the world trading regime, so lots and lots of challenges. So we worked very much on trying to build cluster programs in the city. And you know, in fact, you know, the interesting thing is some of those are still running today, and they've been through, you know, 25, 30 years of ups and downs, sometimes getting a lot of attention from provincial governments, sometimes attention from national government, and really important support in things like the automotive sector, clothing and textiles and leather and chemicals. But I think, you know, if I look back at what were some of the benefits of doing that locally generated work, one is, as local government officials, we learnt from the firms, and we learnt about the dynamics of that were being faced by firms, and not just us in economic development, but people providing services and the like across the city. The second is, you know, and we've got some, you know, people have studied these clusters over time. There's quite a lot of evidence about firm resilience that comes from the firms being facilitated and to support one another through periods of different crisis. Most recently, things like the floods in Durban and the Zuma-inspired riots, if I might refer to it in that form. We also learnt a lot in terms of the need for specialized responses. So obviously cities are responsible for generic improvements in services and infrastructure, and those can be really important to firms. But a lot of thinking about location and firm operations is also thinking about the kinds of specialized needs that firms might have. And in fact, you know, there we learned a lot from our very peculiar past in South Africa, where we saw, despite this very sort of racial Fordist model of developing industrial estates and remote residential race-based residential establishments and that, there was quite a lot of thinking, perhaps in a very distorted way, of how do we build artisanal skills, how do we deal with transport connections between where people live and where people work, what are the specialized needs of industries and the suppliers of those industries, and how do they need to connect to other bits of infrastructure. So, ironically, we went back into a very disturbing past to say, actually, there are things we can carry forward that can bring a much more productive and much more generative kind of way of thinking about dealing with this system of inequality in our cities that might have strong benefits. And I think at times, if I'm bold enough to say that some of those learnings and processes have been quite important to national policy, to think about how to deal with different sectors and different groups of firms. But that process of building policy in a much more sort of embedded fashion, which is what Roderick and others kind of emphasize as so critical, is something that I think can be built and supported and developed, both and in the spaces between cities and secondary cities and provincial and national governments. But it's got to be, it's like, to harvest the sort of spillovers from agglomeration, you need like active institutions, you need to work together, you need mandates, you need responsibilities and resources, and I think those things are really critical and have perhaps ebbed away from a lot of how we try and do local economic development or industrial policy.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, so lots of useful opening remarks and a trip through time, thank you. Okay, I've got a whole long list of questions, but I think I'm going to limit it to one or two because we don't have huge amounts of time on the panel. So what does the panel say? And I'll ask each one of you to just give a very short response. So what do we see as the difference between the role of cities and the role of national and provincial government in driving investment? Let's limit it to that, because we have lots on the table around SEZs and presidential conferences to attract investment. So what is where is the line in the sand? What do cities do? What does national and provincial do? Let's go the same order. Let's start with Trudy. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think I touched a little bit on that in the earlier remarks, that a lot of it really is the enablement of that investment. So, there's limited work that a city could do in going out there to attract FDI. In fact, this was one of the critiques of our investment mobilization efforts, that, you find every local municipality, every secondary city trying to go overseas on a roadshow. That doesn't make sense. But once the investment lands, either independently or through efforts at national or maybe even at provincial level, you find that just starting from identifying local sites and helping to develop those local sites. So I don't want to go to too controversial examples, or rather complex layered examples. But if you think about Amazon, had significant environmental issues, but put that aside, they also had issues around just enablement in terms of trying to build an HQ, trying to source renewable energy for it. And a lot of that is around city-level governance. I think also in terms of how cities think about revenue mobilization and their own finances. There really are important ways where the local government financing model has to shift from trying to maximize a revenue from, say, electricity distribution, from connections, to think about enabling and making those things easy and accessible, and focusing on other more or less distortionary taxation and levies and ways to collect revenue. So I think those are fundamentally the questions that really can only be resolved by cities. Am I able to connect to electricity? What is the electricity tariff? If there's a local distribution agency, what are the planning and spatial regulations that I have to go through and what time it takes to do that? I think that is firmly within that. But secondly, I think that, what Glenn was speaking to in terms of also local coalitions, because it's nice to talk to the CEO and the CEO meets the minister, etc. But in terms of the operational stuff, that then have to implement those investments, talking to municipal and city officials in ways that are productive is also important. And we've seen far too many examples where the conversation is very enforcement-driven, regulatory, top-down, and isn't collaborative. So I think those would be the things I see as kind of firmly within the domain of the city level.
Thanks. Harris, your views on this?
Okay, thank you. I think I already spoke a little bit about that. So they have different roles, right? The national government is really, for me, the broader spatial development strategy, identification of locations with the largest comparative advantage, where would it be desirable to have more industries, which have a potential that needs to be unlocked. They also have a role, maybe the central state, the provinces, in terms of building the intercity transport networks, which is important in order to have to place, trade with one another. They can think also about non-place-based policies, non-spatial policies that are complementarity. For instance, if you have a transport system that works, the intercity, you need to look at how the transportation sector operates, whether it's sufficiently competitive in terms of bringing down the cost of transporting the goods, those type of things. So I think this is really the role of the general role of the national government. For cities and towns, it's really to work on improving the local enabling government with the tools that they have at their disposal in terms of providing the land, making sure there's a land that is available, formal land, the infrastructure services, road, water, electricity, as through dimensions, also telecommunications is very important. And maybe coming back to the point I already mentioned, I think the issue of safety is very important. It's really a hurdle in order to bring jobs to poor locations. But I think there are some roles maybe where both levels of government can intervene. It can be, policies for job matching, training the local labor force. I don't know exactly what are the mandates in South Africa, but I imagine there could be a role for both. And maybe last thing I want to say is we're talking about the coordination of the different levels of governments. But Glenn, mentioned that he learned a lot from firms. I think it's very important to bring into the discussion between the local government and the central government, the private sector. It should not be like a two-type of institution discussion. It's a tripartite discussion, because local development is driven by the entrepreneurs, not by the government or by the infrastructure that is being provided. So it's really important to have investments and policies that will actually be desirable from the private sector perspective, and we understand what we're doing here. So again, having an ex-ante assessment of anything that we do is very important. And actually, just one last sentence. My colleagues, Artie Grover, Shomiklal, and Bill Maloney have written a book, I think it was 2 years ago, called Places, Productivity, and Prosperity, the 3 Ps. And in that book, they talk about the 3 E's. So there are 3 important E's that needs to be implemented. The first is explain the problem. So the analysis that I mentioned, what are the problems? Is it because people are not mobile? Are places too distant from, local domestic market, international market, etc.? Then there's a second E, which is estimate the effect. So you need to understand what would be the direct and indirect, effect of investments, the complementary policies, and this in terms of general equilibrium. In terms of whether you have displacement from economic activity from one place to another, or you're really generating, growth of economic activities. And then the third E, which relates to your question, is to ensure that all actors are aligned. There's coordination, both vertical and horizontal, in the design of the policy, in the spatial allocation of, the means, the implementation, of the capacity of actors. And I will stop there.
Thank you. Glenn?
So you ask about local, national, provincial, and the different roles, and I'm inclined to say that one shouldn't have too many fixed rules about that, because the kind of contingencies of particular contexts demand very different aggregations of institutions and organization of responses, and those will evolve and change over time. Obviously in the broader sense, there are some kind of curbs or barriers you want to put around some things, and I think, Trudy mentioned the one of, everyone, I was in Beijing once, and I came across a really small northwest municipality running a sort of trade show with like 15 delegates at the hotel. So you sort of thought, well, there's an interesting choice. But in fact, they had also been subsidized by one of the Chinese provinces to come and do that. But I think there are less helpful and more helpful things. I think that it's really important that we create an environment where there's an agreement that we can go in and explore challenges and opportunities as a multi-set of actors, including the state and local business associations, and determine kind of paths of action and responsibilities that arise from that in those contexts. I also think that one of the really key things is that all those three levels or spheres of government struggle with is attention to the existing firms and their needs and the system of firms that they work in. And I think we heard a bit earlier how important existing firms are for employment creation, but they're also actually really critical for new investment. And there's an extraordinary amount of attention to trying to find the next big thing, the next investor. We subsidize that through SEZs. Municipalities throw infrastructure at new property developments in the hope of attracting new firms. But I think we've lost that real interest in meeting the needs of all sorts of existing firms, whether they're small businesses, medium or large. And I think kind of refocusing attention on that imperative, I think, is really important.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to do one more question, and then I'll open it up for comments and questions from the audience. And so we saw earlier today in Ivan's presentation around the challenges of low growth of businesses and the few startups, and we see it in other data as well. So the role of supporting small businesses, it's there at national, but a lot of it has been pushed to local governments to do. But they're often not resourced to do that. So some of the bigger municipalities may have some functions, but also the cities may have some functions around and some support. But is it really the role of local government to support that small enterprise, or should we be kicking national government to do a better job and working, slightly differently? So say to local government, just focus on doing your thing, but actually setting up the support measures, the incubators, the accounting support programs, the voucher programs, whatever the national government has been doing. How do we get that right? What is the role here? Let's start with Glenn, because you did this.
The first time I think I met Saul, he was responsible for, with the team, writing the first South African small business sort of policy framework. So he knows these answers probably better than most. But I think that there's been a sort of a gradual shift towards thinking of small business development as a series of sort of discrete programs that we'll provide training, finance, we'll provide some dedicated facilities, or we'll create kind of incentives through the public procurement system, or try and regulate small business into corporate supply chains through various agreements and deals. And I think, those to a degree do have a role to play. But, certainly the research that I've done, the constraints that small businesses face in terms of the poor public realm, the costs that they have to bear disproportionately in terms of access to better services, to reliable infrastructure, and those things really get neglected. And it's almost like we want to compensate for our public sector failures by trying to sort of hand out programs of, endless programs of sort of support that don't actually deal with some of the kind of core conditions that firms face of safety and security. I think Trudy and Harris mentioned as well. There's my sort of sense is that we need to go back and think about where firms operate the businesses. Are the streetlights working? How late can they open? Can they get access to freeways? And does the electricity turn on when they switch it on? Those sorts of things are huge barriers, I think, to small businesses being able to perform. And they also are barriers towards formalization if one thinks of that as a relevant agenda.
Okay, Harris, your views?
Yes, so I have much less to say about small and medium and micro enterprises. I think they're part of the economic fabric, right? An economy includes large firms, middle firms, smaller firms, and they kind of work together. And I understand that even if they're not necessarily the target of the industrial policy, they may benefit from it. I read that in the case of the special economic zones in South Africa, there was cultivation of the links between the firms within the zone, but also the small and medium enterprises outside the zone that had linkages with the other firms. I think it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of the role of the government, and especially the local government, I think there are things that actually matter. There can be the facilitation of community engagement, business hubs, also maybe a local procurement of those firms by the local government. But again, I'm not sure where you have to put the cursor between what the national governments need to do, or the provincial or the local governments. I think it's all about collaborative efforts, and I will let the South African experts, talk about this.
Trudy?
Thanks for that. I also don't have too much to add. I mean, I think it's all been covered adequately. The only thing I would say is that for the informal sector, the informal sector can be very unique to a particular place. So I think there could be more scope to think about even some of the financing instruments that are deployed by like big national programs, NEF, SDF, etc., to really think of how to collaborate with local authorities who have a much better sense of what the informal economy dynamics are and what's likely to be more successful in a specific place. So that's the only thing I would say I see a real gap there in terms of SME development. I also really do have a hard stop. So if I can just insert a bit of a closing remark here, to say the one thing we haven't touched on, understandably, is around the politics and the governance at local level. And there are no easy solutions. But I think a lot, when you see project pipeline and it references cities or municipalities under administration or with very unstable local governments, it obviously makes one pause in terms of the viability of local economic development. It's very difficult to think of development strategies where there's as much volatility as we see in certain areas. So, I mean, probably not an easy solve for us, but I think the politics and the governance also play a very crucial role. Thanks.
Thanks. Let's open it up to comments. We'll start there and then move here.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to talk at the start, we're talking about industrial policy, specifically in the aspect of the just energy transition. Simply put, there's always winners and losers when it comes to anything done in economics and anything done in changing the strategy of a system. The South African economy is in a very poor state, so we cannot really afford more losers. And I'm going to take this just as a quick example. You're talking about battery manufacturing, and it first popped up to me for a couple of questions. Do we have an international comparative advantage in the production of that? If not, are we planning to safeguard that industry as an infant industry? If we are planning to do that, what is the tax implications? Who's going to fund them? For how long? Further to that, if we have decided that this industry is something we want to pursue, at what level of manufacturing are we going to do that? Often I find that when we develop these policies specifically for moving forward on an industrial landscape, at a high level it is thought of and penned down without the understanding of the implications down the line. Because the problem there is then it becomes unimplementable, or the shock of that change cannot be absorbed. The other thing is, lastly, all of these policy decisions often made at national level, and I'll take Spluma as an example. Spluma was there to replace the 4 ordinances with the idea of creating a uniform policy structure for land development, to create uniformity around the country. We are, I think, if I might speak under correction, but we sit with about 256 unique bylaws relating to Spluma, making land development significantly more complicated. And then the last issues around anything of changing the fundamental structure, specifically related to the just energy transition, is as South Africa as a whole, we sit with a very complex labor situation, right? Where we have to balance labor intensity, unions, high unemployment, and that in itself, that instability that we have there, regardless of political instability, which plays a big role, also makes these investing organizations really reticent to spend money anywhere in South Africa. So specifically, if we're talking about green, modern, just energy transition and everything that's surrounding that space that we have to do, how are we going to change that landscape? But because those are the building blocks that will have to change before people will even want to touch that industry within our landscape. Thank you very much.
Arvin, do you want to ask?
Thanks very much. There are undoubtedly massive short-term challenges that I don't want to touch on because we've talked quite a lot about those. But in a longer-term vision in response to the questions posed is, we haven't heard the notion of an ecosystem, right? We need to think about our local economies, our city economies as ecosystems. And that means, in my view, that local government, the metros are key players in that system, both in terms of supporting in various ways, but also in understanding it and responding to it appropriately. So this can't be done from national level. We need, in some ways, to turn things around, right? So national government comes in to support key interventions with the resources and capabilities that might be available at that level. But fundamentally, we need to have, our metros as key players supporting, strengthening, reinforcing the ecosystem in a holistic, systemic way, not through narrow, partial, project-based or sectoral interventions.
Thanks. Anthony?
So I think, the thing, I always struggle to engage in industrial policy conversations in South Africa because I find that it's not obvious to me what DTIC is trying to optimize. There's so many overlapping matrices that it uses for prioritization, and I don't know that it knows what it's trying to optimize. So we had, and it's not just DTIC as government, we had a whole ministry for small businesses, but DTIC thinks of the economy in terms of sectors. Which is a different way of looking at the world. We don't think about are we promoting exports? Are we supporting incumbents? Are we doing spatial work? And are we doing transformation? Because I think that all of those lenses that DTIC uses to look at what it's trying to optimize don't lead to coherence. They lead to a menu of choices that can be made that create a lot of discretion, but which don't actually create clarity and send clear signals to investors and to markets about what we want to achieve. And I think that the spatial stuff, I think as Glenn's previous presentation made clear, it doesn't feature terribly strongly in the thinking. And I think it becomes kind of arbitrary to then impose it on everything else as well. And I feel like what we need is a lot more clarity about how we think about the choices we have to make on industrial policy, and be much clearer on what the trade-offs are and where our opportunity sets lie. At the moment, to me, it feels like, well, anything that looks vaguely like it could have a positive impact is potentially supported by some portion of the range of tools. And I feel like we need a lot more clarity before you can start making, having engagements on things like the spatial implications of it.
Okay. We can go a bit over because we started. Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I think we can't really take any questions.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so then let's start with responses. We seem to have lost Trudy.
Yeah,
she had to drop off. Oh, okay. So let's start with a response from Harris, and you can also wrap up with a closing comment.
Okay. No, thank you. They are super interesting comments. I agree with all of them, actually. Maybe just to add a little bit to this, the question of what we are trying to optimize. It's the most important question. I think I will say again, there needs to be some type of framework that is applied in order to make the good choices here. So what my colleagues were proposing in that book, Place, Productivity and Prosperity, again, is explain the problem, estimate the effects, and ensure that all the actors are aligned. So when you do talk about estimate the effect, you have to have robust economic analytics in, I would say, a holistic way, a little bit like what Ivan, was saying. Just to look at, general equilibrium, how does it affect the economy as a whole, not just the place? Is there displacement? Are there winners and losers, and who are the losers? And one of the questions was, one of the comments was, we cannot afford to have more losers. I agree, but the problem with that, if we only base our choices in equity terms, we may lose the efficiency of promoting growth and creating value. So I think what is very important is to have several policies in place at the same time in this holistic perspective. You have to have, policies that may foster, economic activity, but the losers have to be compensated. It's very important to have redistribution. I know it's politically difficult to implement, but there needs to be redistribution. There needs to be safety nets in places that are not being helped. So I think those were my comments on the comments. And maybe to conclude, I think there's a comeback of industrial policies globally. So it's really what people are discussing. But there may be, some of them may be actually occurring in a different context. We talked about, the green transition, what industrial policies to address, climate. There's the issue of, globalization and the discontent that goes with globalization. So there are new themes, that are emerging. At the city level, I think it makes sense to have place-based policies, but they have to be thought properly. There are lots of pitfalls. They have to be thought properly, they have to be done properly. And I think we should not just talk about, fiscal instruments. If we just talk about fiscal instruments, there's, the risk of windfall effects with maybe little returns, actually. Like enterprise that would have operated anyway may continue to operate without generating new jobs. There's a risk of displacement that I mentioned. And maybe some of the policies do not need to be done because markets are imperfect, but governments are also imperfect. So we need also to think about spatially blind policies as well. We cannot just think about within the menu of industrial policies and spatial policies, what we want to do. We need to act spatially blind and place-based policies at the same time. And maybe the key aspect, again, is to take a step back and start with an economic assessment of all the policy options. So that would be my recommendation in a very general terms, because I'm not an expert of South Africa, I'm more of an economic theorist.
Thank
and
you.
I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Glenn, you've got the last word.
I think, I would encourage that at this point in time, because if we're really honest about it, we don't have something that really stands up as being a national industrial policy at the moment. We had the National Industrial Policy Framework, quite a long time ago. We've had some drafts aiming to try and cohere something together. But I think the starting point might be to do some serious kind of assessment, a bit like Anthony was saying, about where we've made gains and where the continuation of those gains seems to be stuttering and failing, and what can we learn from that, and where there are these gaps and new challenges that we have to accommodate. And I don't think we can really work in a context where industrial policies are like a series of predetermined boxes, and if things don't fit into those boxes, then they get kind of tossed aside as being irrelevant. So I'll take examples of firms raising for over a decade the shockingly poor performance of ports, and that just didn't land anywhere in government. DTI didn't feel it really could push that agenda. Other ministries weren't that interested in hearing that message. Transnet denied it. So some very peculiar things happened. So we've got to sort of reimagine what that box needs to be to take our country forward over the next decade or so. And I think that some serious kind of reflection on what's worked spatially, what hasn't worked. And I think there are bits and pieces of that. There has been work done by this Harvard round. We had Stiglitz being very handsomely paid a few years back to come with some thoughts about the national economy. But I think we could really do some serious interrogation to try and build a kind of a new policy framework that's much more inclusive, that allows for these multi-scalar kind of connections, and that can respond to this diversity of things that have been raised.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions and comments, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Truly, thank you to all of you. Harris, thank you so much for joining from so far away. Really do appreciate it. For those of you interested, Harris also wrote one of the discussion documents at the beginning of this specifically on SEZs and all space-based industrial policy. So it is truly worth a read if you want to have a look.
This is a joint document with Klaus Rabe from PDG.
Yeah, with Klaus Rabe. Yes, exactly. Yes. Very, very good paper. So thank you. Okay, I think let's go. Yeah? Are you okay?
No, I'm just disconnecting, but we'll follow the rest of the conference. It's very interesting. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Harris.
Bye-bye.
Okay.